Hi and welcome to my crazes. Um, this week, you can see it's my butcher's block, and you're probably wondering, okay, what's going on? Why is this in English? Where's the tractor? One of my good friends, Barbara, has been asking me to do a video about bread making for a while, so I figured now was a good time for it. It's something that I got into a couple years ago, and it's something I'm pretty passionate about. I love making bread, any kind of pizza dough, sourdough, brioche, cinnamon buns, anything bread related. There's a real reason why I'm this big. Um, so um, there's a lot of videos online about making bread, a lot of recipes, very exact way of doing things. But I figured I'd show you how I do it to simplify things. It's something I do weekly. So basically, I use this container that I've marked with a pencil just to measure out my water. I just start with that. This way, I don't have to measure things every time I make bread, and it makes one loaf. A lot of recipes are for two, three loaves. Um, so this works out well for me. I usually just fill up the water up to the line. It's about 3 cups of water, just to give you an idea. But nothing in my recipes is really exact. That's why I suggest you look at the textures more than anything. I use active dry yeast for my dough right now. I will be making a video about levain, sourdough, so keep an eye out for that. That'll come out soon. But active dry yeast works really well. There's a lot of different varieties that you can buy at the store, either quick rise, some made specifically for bread ovens, other for pizza and everything, but it all works the same. So regardless of the kind that you have, what I'm telling you today works. So I'm using um, about uh, let's say a teaspoon worth of active dry yeast. I just put it in water. Some people put sugar in the water. Some people put flour in the water as well. I just leave it like that. It's just a matter of leaving it long enough for it to raise, to kind of wake up and start doing its bubbly thing. I usually scrape off some of the leftover flour from my previous loaf, and that's enough to feed the yeast, and it'll start rising like that. So basically, you just put the yeast in the water, give it a good 10, 15, 20 minutes, enough time to get it to wake up, and you'll start seeing some bubbles and everything. So I just mix it up, make sure it's well um, distributed in the water, and that's it. Just leave it like that for 15 minutes, and then we'll come back in 15-20 for the next step. A lot of the information I'm going to give you today is sort of approximate. Um, it's the way I do bread, it's how I've always done it. Nothing is critical, and the more you do it, the more experience you get about how your ingredients work, how your yeast works, and all of that. Um, so for me, I was in a hurry that morning, so I didn't have time to let it let it rest for 15 minutes. So that took maybe 5 minutes later. So that's why you don't see any kind of gases or anything floating. Usually, when the yeast starts working, you can see some gases and something going to the surface of the water. Um, and that also depends on the temperature in your house. There's a lot of variables, but nothing's critical. Keep an eye out. Once you start kind of knowing your ingredients, it is going to be a bit easier. But you can't really do wrong. Worst that happens is your bread is going to be a bit more dense than what you'd like, but it's still going to be quite edible. Um, so the next step is just to put the flour in. The flour that I use is a mix of integral spelt, integral wheat flour, and whole wheat flour, which is different from integral flour. It's kind of a very dense flour mix. I use that basically because I'm diabetic, so I try to have as much fiber and protein in my flour. I do put a little bit of white all-purpose flour as well in my mix, just to kind of give it a bit more elasticity. So I have about 5 cups of flour in there, maybe 4 cups actually. Um, and I'm gonna add some more later. It's a lot easier to add the dry stuff than water, so it's okay if you don't put as much as you need from the get-go. Just start with 4 cups of flour for the 3 cups of water that's in there. That should get you pretty close to what you want, and the texture you're looking for is really kind of a it needs to form up into a ball, but it needs to be pretty soft still. Right now, if you look, it's way too soft. It's still runny. It's almost a liquid. So I will be adding another cup of flour to that. So that's maybe I'm about 4.5 cups right now, maybe not quite 5. I'm just eyeballing it, looking at the texture, see how it's mixing up. And at that point, I noticed that I forgot to put the salt, um, which isn't a big deal because one of the principles of bread making is that a lot of recipes will call to mix only the flour and the water first, and there's a reaction called autolyse, which is it just softens the fibers in the flour and just develops the gluten. So just water and flour is actually kind of a good thing. And then in a later step, you can add the salt and the yeast. So as you can see, I added a bit more flour just to get kind of the texture that I wanted. It's kind of getting there. And I will be adding the salt just in a minute there. Trying to remember what I said in French and translate as I go to make it as interesting. So here I'm adding the salt. The quantity is about a tablespoon of salt, but that's kind of going by to taste. I like my bread not too salty, especially because it's for breakfast. So, I usually put peanut butter on it, and so I don't want it to be too salty either. If it was for a dinner loaf, I'd probably go a bit more salty. Very good with butter. um, so as you can see, I'm just mixing up the dough just to check the consistency. It should form up into a ball, but still be pretty soft. So that's kind of how I like it. It makes for a dough that's a bit harder to manipulate and to form up and doesn't quite keep its shape as much, but it makes for a lighter dough. So it rises a bit better than something that's a bit more dense. It takes a bit less time and lets the gases develop more. So basically, at this point, you just let it rest. The way it works is I usually do 2 steps of folding for every half hour. So in the next half hour, I do a first folding and then another folding, and then maybe you let it rise for an hour, 2 hours. Then you shape it into the final form. Then you put it in the oven for to cook. So those are the steps that we're gonna see right now. I forgot to mention to put the cap on and just let it rest for half an hour, and then we'll be back to fold the dough. Folding the dough is really just because this is a no kneading method. So this kind of replaces the kneading. So you just wet your hand and basically you just grab the dough, stretch it out, fold it back on itself towards the center, and that helps develop the gluten and the fibers and kind of give it a stretch, and it helps give a structure to the dough so that it keeps its shape better, especially since it's a very soft dough. You need that structure, otherwise it's just going to be a big flop on the working surface. So as you fold it back on itself and stretch it, it just kind of starts developing that fiber structure that's going to kind of keep the shape of the dough. So this is what replaces kneading, and you basically just keep folding like that. You can you just keep going as long as it. You'll see you kind of the elasticity of the dough changes, and it becomes kind of very slick and very springy. So you kind of want that texture. I wet my hand again because it becomes pretty sticky pretty quickly. So this is very important, especially for more that flour that has more fibers and proteins. You need those steps, otherwise, it doesn't make for a very nice texture. So you kind of see that the dough is already kind of more elastic, and that's enough for the first stretching. Um, so you just leave it like that for another 15, 20, 30 minutes. Let's say 30 minutes, and then you come back and you do the same thing again. The second time around, you don't need to do it as much, so it's only a few times that you will fold it over. But that first step, because it replaces kneading, it's important to do it properly. So this is the second time we stretch the dough. Um, it's already started to rise a little bit, so you can see the bubbles, and the dough is more springy, and it kind of spread out a little bit more. Usually you want to stretch it out like that and then come back a third time to make it into the shape that you want. But that morning I was pretty pretty hungry. I had to work. I didn't have breakfast yet. It was pretty early, so I just figured, okay, I'll just form it up. All it changes is how much time it takes to rise, and nothing's critical. You can experiment a little bit and just keep an eye out the first few times you make it. Make sure you have some time that day, and you can check up on it, because you don't want the dough to rise too much, because that's usually when it really gets into a flat bread that's not really interesting. But you can see here I'm just folding it over again. I'm going a bit more gently this time around, and I don't do it as much, mostly to just preserve the stretchiness that we got the first few times. And that's pretty much it for this step. And as I was saying, usually I would leave it like that for another half hour and then come back and shape it into the loaf that I want, whether it's a baguette or an actual loaf. I usually do it in a third step, but that morning I just said, okay, I'm in a hurry, so I'm just going to shape it right then after the second folding and let it to rise before it gets baked. I'm using Banton, which is a kind of a basket that's purposely made for that. I used some good ones that I got off of a store nearby that isn't too expensive. There are some available on Amazon and other places online. They should cost about $20-$30. If you pay more, you can probably find a deal somewhere else. On Amazon, you kind of have to be careful, because the ones that they sell are made of bamboo. So those can have some fibers. I think I'll show a picture of that or an image of that in a bit. They have some fibers, so they're not that good. Make sure they are authentic Banneton, not made out of bamboo. So you're just putting flour rolling the flour around, make sure the whole surface is coated, and then you can just put the dough in the banton to rise. And there's what I was saying. So that's another basket that I got off of Amazon, and you can see the little fibers sticking out of it. You can use it. You can put some paper, um, parchment paper or something at the bottom. It'll still work. It's just easier to use the right kind. You can use any other round recipient as well. You can use any kind of mixing bowl that you might have to let the dough rise. So I put a bit of flour on my butcher block to help um, shaping the dough because it's made of integral flour. Shaping the dough, you have to be gentle with it. If it was white flour, you can stretch that thing to no end, and you can pretty much, there's no limit to it. It'll just keep stretching and keep its shape. But with integral flour, you kind of have to be a bit more delicate and not work it as much. Otherwise, it's just gonna lose its structure. So I just work the dough, kind of fold it on itself underneath, and try to form it into a ball. And once I'm satisfied that it's sort of even and will make a nice loaf, I just put it in the bento to rise. I usually put the folds underneath because once I flop it inside the skillet, the folds will sort of open up, and that's what's going to make the nice open, crusty look of the bread. You can also put it upside down and uh, leave the nice surface underneath at that point and at the top in the skillet, and then slice it open to have a nice pattern. So either or, everything works. And you can let your creativity go and have different kinds of breads and make it pretty. That's usually where it comes in. I made a bread, cocoa and cranberry bread the other day. Super easy. Basically, you do the exact same thing, except when you put the flour in, you add cocoa powder and some cranberries to it. That's it. You can do cinnamon raisin bread. You can do some bread with nuts in them. So just go crazy, have fun. The principles is always the same thing: yeast, flour, water, salt, and then you have some form of bread that you can work with. The dough will rise and about double in size because I'm using integral flour. It's not quite as um, elastic as white flour, so it won't rise as much, but it should about double in size. So that's what you want to keep an eye for. So at this point, what you want to do is just let the dough rise for maybe 1 to 3 hours, depending on temperature and all, the kind of yeast that you have. So it's going to take about that. Keep an eye out on it. It should about double in size, like I said. Um, I wanted to show you. That's about an hour later for my dough. So clearly, it's not quite risen enough. So we're gonna just leave it aside and let it rise a bit more. Although it's a good time to put your skillet, or if you have a pizza stone, or if you have something that needs to get preheated in your oven, you want to do that at this point. I use a cast iron skillet. It's something I got in a flea market somewhere for cheap. It's kind of the perfect size. The advantage of that is that it traps the humidity that comes out of the dough when you bake it. So that's kind of the perfect thing for dough or for cooking bread. Is you want high humidity to start with, and then you want the humidity to slowly get lower as you cook your dough. Commercial bread oven have humidity injectors in them. So one thing that I've done is put a aluminum pan at the bottom of the oven and just dump some water in it to increase the um, humidity in the oven. But if you cook your loaf in a skillet like this, you don't need to do that because the humidity is going to get trapped by the cover. So I'm just going to preheat it in the oven at 475 Fahrenheit. It's high, but we want a very dark crust. It just adds a lot of taste. You don't want a nice soft golden color. You actually want a caramel dark color. That's really the most tasty, the best taste. The So what I do is I just preheat it in the oven. I put both the cover and the skillet in the oven, uh, side by side. This way, when I put the bread in the oven to cook, all I have to do is put the cap on, and then we're ready to go. And it's already preheated. It's good that the cover also is really hot. So that's another 45 minutes later. My skillet is hot in the oven. My dough is now about double in size. There's a nice dome on it, nice bubbles. We can see that it's pretty soft. It's not too soft either, so it will pull out of the banton. So I'm just going to pull out the skillet out of the oven. So it's really hot. It's been in there for 45 minutes. At this point, at 475, most oven mitts aren't quite enough, so I usually have double up just to be safe. It's really hot, and you kind of have to be gentle. Some people put the dough out of the banton first and then transfer it into the skillet. I just kind of dump it in there, kind of try to go gently and stay low. And sometimes it will flatten out, but if you have the right textures, it's going to keep its shape. That's one of the reasons why we fold the dough as well, to have that, you know, that retention capacity. So after that, it's just a matter of putting it in the oven for 15 minutes first with the cover on. Um, and after that, you remove the cover and leave it in the oven for another 35 minutes. So you can look at it, check on the color. So a good 50 minutes is a good time for that size of loaf. 15 minutes covered, 35 minutes without, or 30 minutes without. And you want it a nice dark color. The banton leave a nice round flour circles like that. That makes it pretty. But bread is bread. It's going to be tasty even if it doesn't have the nice little patterns on it. So we'll be back when the bread is cooked, baked. Now's the time to pull it out of the oven. Kind of have to be careful because it's really hot. So I just basically flop it over on that sheet, and those silicone pads are kind of nice because they wash easy. They get pretty clean. You can rinse them pretty easily. So there it is. That's our nice bread. You can see where it opened up is where the folds were in the dough that I was mentioning earlier. Also, one thing to note, and that is often ignored in recipes, is the cool down time. You want your loaf, your bread, to cool down to room temperature before you cut into it. I know it's tempting and the smell is incredible, but it's really better if you wait until it's cooled down. Unless it's a thin baguette, it doesn't matter as much. But for loaves, it's better if the humidity gets out of the bread more naturally, because it's gonna keep drying out the inside of the bread, and it won't have like the cake texture. It's actually gonna have it bread texture. So now's the time to cut into it. I really wish I could share the smell, but scratch and sniff YouTube isn't the thing yet. So you'll have to be satisfied with how it looks. Um, at this point, you really need to have it at room temperature. I usually cut it in half or slice it off and then freeze it in slices. It's just easier for me. Although at the rate we eat it, it doesn't have time to go bad. But I usually cut it in half like that anyway. The advantage of cooking it in a skillet is that it sort of restrict the not the growth, but the bubbles, so it doesn't go too big and have these huge holes in it. So it's perfect for breakfast because you don't have your peanut butter leaking all through the holes and all over the place. But it does have a nice even hole structure, if you want to call it that. So the bread is well cooked throughout as well, which is really important. Otherwise, it will have kind of a cake texture, which is sort of weird to be honest. But this way, it kind of tastes good. And because it's integral flour, it can have sort of a grainy, sandy texture to it. But that's why it's really, really important to fold the doughs when you do the initial steps. So anyway, that's the bread that I make every week. I make one like that every week. If you have questions or would like me to do some more of these videos, just let me know in the comments. If something was unclear, please contact me, ask me, and I'll try to be more specific next time or answer your questions. And I really hope that you get to try this out. It's really not that difficult. Experimenting is fun. It doesn't have to be exact, and the more you make it, the more you get a feel for it, the more fun you can have with it. So enjoy, and thank you for watching this video.